It's the Brad and John Show.
This show was originally broadcast on Monday morning, November 25th. This is B Block. The reason I mention that is because the people who are listening live will say, hey, we know what date it is, but when we put this up on the podcast and on the YouTube channel, sometimes the date reference is important because that'll give you an idea of what the current things we were talking about were. In the previous segment, in Block A, John talked about the abortion campaign being predominantly white, correct? And here, you said I didn't have it turned on for a minute. Say that again, one more time.
That's correct. It was.
Okay. The interesting aspect of that is that, and John, this is just, as they call it, anecdotal, but whenever you see abortion protesters, the protesters who are pro-abortion, I don't think I ever see any black people there. And I'm not trying to be racial, but, and matter of fact, on both sides of the equation, rarely do you ever see any black people on either sides of that equation is in the protests. Get what I'm saying?
I do, and I think it's unfortunately one of the failings of Pete Buttigieg is the inability to fix our racist transportation system. Because if we had better access to roads, if folks that were POCs had better access to roads, Brad, they would be able to take the bus or the Metro link to the abortion protests.
John, you're riding right into this thing. It's just like they say that the black people are being disenfranchised by the voter ID law. And
yes.
I have black friends of mine who get mad about that because they say, do people think that black people can't get a driver's license? Which is sort of the interesting angle when you look at that, is that people say, well, the black people are being disenfranchised because they can't get a picture ID. I will tell you an interesting story, okay? Maybe you'll find this interesting, maybe you won't. I'm somewhere doing business, and two of the people that work there are having a discussion. The one lady is talking about the fact that a guy she knows can't get an ID, and he can't open up a bank account because he can't get an ID. And I said to her, the state will do that for free. And she says, what? I go, yeah, if you call the Secretary of State's office, they have a special service where they don't care who you are, rich, poor, black, white, green, yellow. They will do all the background work for you. They will get you a copy of your driver's license. They will do all these things, all the things you need to get a picture ID for FREE. And as she's standing there listening to me, the other woman, she's like a John Combest kind, she's on the internet researching this, and she says, he's right. Here it is on the Secretary of State's page. Why does this always keep coming up? You know what I mean?
Well, because there was probably a time, Brad, in fairness, 20 years ago, where a voter ID law would negatively affect either the elderly or would affect people of color because of whatever victimhood narrative story you want to go with. We don't have access to our birth certificates or something like that. But then the Secretary of State, and let's give Jay Ashcroft credit for this. During his term as Secretary of State, he prioritized making sure that people can get an ID for free and do exactly what you said, Brad. Go into a state office and be able to have folks do the work for you and get you a state-issued ID. So that issue, you know how people are, Brad. They hear something 20 years ago, and then they just repeat it in 2024.
But the idea behind, how many times, one of these days I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to start this on Monday, and I'm going to go through an entire 7-day period. I'm going to write down every time I ask for an ID. And there's probably not a week that doesn't go by that I'm not asking for an ID for something or other. You know what I'm saying? It's to the point
to tell a great Brad Hildebrand story, it's like you going by who you appropriately refer to as Checkpoint Charlie. When you go to a hospital, if you go through certain areas, they're going to want to see your ID.
Right. And to the point where I think the ultimate thing this was that when Eric Holder was in office, he was the guy that's championing this. It's discrimination against black people because they can't get IDs. But the interesting part of that is if you went to Washington, D.C., and you went to the Department of Justice building, did you get into the Department of Justice building? Guess what you need, John?
You need an ID to get in. You don't just let anybody in, Brad, and it's for safety purposes.
So isn't that sort of hypocritical that the guy who's saying that showing an ID, a picture ID, is racially discriminatory, but yet you can't get into his building without a picture ID? It's just, to me, it's like, okay, whatever. Okay, candidate school. You want to talk about this?
Yes, please do. So set it up, Brad. And I also want you to reference the fact that This is not your first time speaking there.
This is my second time, and this was sort of interesting. The first time I don't want to say hired, because this is, I didn't make any money for this. I did it for free, which is fine. I do lots of stuff for free. Matter of fact, too many things for free, some people would say. This was put on by the St. Charles County Republican Central Committee, and I did this, I don't know, maybe it was a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And at that time, Dave Zucker, who was he was a farmer alderman in Dardenne Prairie, then became the mayor. He's the one that asked me if I'd do it. And essentially what it is, it's put on by like I said, the St. Charles County Central Republican Committee to help people who've never run for office essentially navigate the waters of how do I, register, how do I set up my committee, how do I, do this, how do I do that, how do I advertise, that kind of thing. And I was invited this time by Debbie McFarland, who is on the Central Committee. And interestingly enough, I didn't recognize the name, but she is the sister of the late Jeff Hansen, who owns Hansen's Tree Service. I don't know if you knew that or not.
Oh, nice. Very nice.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she contacted me about a month ago and said, would I be interested? And she said at that point in time, they only had like 2 or 3 people. I think there were upwards of 20 people there. Okay, Saturday morning at the headquarters out there in St. Charles, right next to the Hampton Inn on West Clay. First up was Tom Smith, who I didn't put 2 and 2 together. I didn't realize that he was the same guy behind the Soda Museum, which
which I mentioned to you on Friday.
Right,
you didn't know that.
Right. I knew he was a political guru, but I didn't realize it was the same guy. He was up first. Then it was Mike Sommer, who is really brilliant at this. Mike Sommer is a CPA, very much politically involved. He's been on school boards. His wife was a former state rep. I don't think he was ever a state rep, was he? I don't think he was.
Correct. He was not.
Okay. But he runs a CPA firm, and he does tons of work in the political field, which is super crazy. And it's funny because of the fact that he starts off his presentation. Tom Smith did the first hour, and Mike Sommer did the second hour. He starts off his presentation by saying, if you're not asleep now, you will be when I'm done. And he goes through all the incredible, crazy stuff you have to do with the Missouri Ethics Commission. And there's reports, all sorts of crazy reports. There's quarterly reports. There's 7-day reports. There's 2-day reports. There's
8-day reports. Yeah.
Just bizarre, weird stuff. And he goes through that, and he is so good at this. And he tells you that, what you should never do it. You should always have a committee. He gives you all the examples. It's very complicated, and he gives a very thorough explanation of this. And once again, most of the people who are there are people who have never run for office before. Most of the people there were running for boards of education. There were a couple of people, state reps kind of thing. There were some of them were running for aldermans and things like that. And a couple of them were just there to essentially say, okay, I'm interested in ultimately running for an office. Don't know exactly which office to run for, but I want to see what's involved with this. And I would imagine there are some people that walked away from that going like, not for me, because you find out it's very, very complicated. Now, the Tom Smith thing is interesting because, see, I get up there and I bill myself. I'm the third at bat, okay? I bill myself as the disruptor because everybody there, including the 2 guest speakers after me, which in order was Tim Jones, former Speaker of the House, and now he does a radio show on Real Talk. What is not Real Talk? No, he's News Talk STL. All these stations, I get confused, okay? And he also runs his own political advisory office. I guess he's sort of like a Tom Smith kind of guy in a way, correct? Is that what he does as well, too?
Yep, let's go.
Okay. So they all say, and then was Bill Eigel was last but not least, they all say there's 3 things you need to do to become elected. And the 3 things are, number 1, you need yard signs. Number 2, you need to knock doors. And number 3, you need to send out mailers. Okay, now, to me, all 3 of those are old school, okay? Door knocking is as old as the political system. They were probably, if you go back in the history, the framers of our Constitution were probably knocking on doors, getting support from people. And that has happened through the centuries. I mean, would you agree with me on that as far as door knocking is concerned?
Yeah, for sure. Direct voter appeals. Yeah.
Right.
Face-to-face conversations.
Face-to-face conversation, talking to people. Back in the day, there was no mass media, so you had the Lincoln Douglas debates where they were, and matter of fact, the interesting part of this is when you hear the term, I don't know if you know this or not, you probably do know this, when you hear the candidate in stumping, you know what that really means?
Yeah, standing on a stump to speak to a group of people.
Exactly. Back in the day, the candidates didn't have a podium, so they would go somewhere, and there would be a cut-down tree, there would be a stump sitting somewhere, and they would stand up on the stump, and they would give their pitch to the.
There we go. So those are the main three things.
Right, and I think it was Tim Jones who made the point that do those three. And if you got any extra money, do something else. Okay, I'm from the school of thought that you have, and if you looked around the room, I would say the audience for the most part, the people there for the most part were 40-plussers, okay? There might have been a couple, late 20s, early 30 people, potential candidates, but most of them were 40-plussers, okay? And especially if you are like 40 today, you essentially grew up in the new era of social media, the internet, YouTube, videos, and things like that, right?
That's exactly right.
I say that I do agree that door knocking is important. I do agree that mailers are important. And see, once again, you're talking about something when I say John makes fun of me because I sent out a personalized letter to the candidates to advertise in the station. And he always makes fun of me. Hey, Brad sent out direct mail. No, you always say, I sent out a postcard. That's what I said.
Direct mail is very effective when it's followed up with personal contact. You're exactly right, Brad. I believe in direct mail.
Which is what I did. I sent out.
Okay, good for you. You've clarified that for the last probably 9 months now. Go ahead.
I followed up with a phone call. Okay? So they all just essentially said, those are the three most important things. And once again, I agree with them, but if you're going after the young voters, for the most part, don't look at their mail, and I think it's a different deal. And I think that what you saw in this past election, that what was more important, to be on MSNBC or to be a guest of Joe Rogan? Answer the question, John. That's an easy one.
Joe Rogan by a mile.
Right. And the whole concept behind this is, and matter of fact, I heard somebody the other day, I heard a clip, someone at MSNBC saying, well, Joe Rogan, I mean, this is on a show. I didn't actually listen to MSNBC, but they were saying, Joe Rogan doesn't have a journalism degree, and he might be espousing views that are not necessarily vetted. And I'm going like, that's why people listen to Joe Rogan.
That's the whole point.
The whole point is doesn't have a journalism degree. He's the average Joe. And I don't mean like Joe as in the Joe Rogan, but he's the average guy who is not necessarily hip deep into the political, a mire, so to speak. He's sort of watching this from afar, so to speak. And once again, I think one of the huge mistakes that Kamala Harris made was not going on Joe Rogan's show. I mean, Trump went on there, and
I agree. And I don't mean to cut you short, Brad, but let's get back to what you said, because you were making a really good point about the fact that the world has changed. So what else did you tell the folks at the candidate school?
I said, and I came out with the assumption, I started my presentation with the assumption, none of you probably have a whole lot of money. And if you're going to go out and fundraise, if you're running for some of these lower positions, you may end up with $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. And to some positions, that's quite a lot of money. If you look at some of these lower kind of races. My thing was, I talked about doing guerrilla warfare, essentially doing, earned media versus paid media. Talked about the fact that there's all these local radio stations that you call people on, and chances are you can get on. I mentioned about podcasts, and I said, Joe Rogan's not going to have you in his podcast, but there's a bunch of people in the St. Louis area, and I didn't mention specifically, but I talked about some of the radio stations that do podcasts, and you've mentioned Mark Bland several times about being a very interesting guy. And once again, it costs you nothing to do that. And the interesting part of that is that most of the time, what people don't realize is rarely does anybody ever call me and say, hey, I'd like to get in your show. But when they do, almost always like, okay, when do you want to go? To the point where I'm interested, tell me what you want to talk about. And I've said this time and time again that I think it's so sad that people think that they can't be a part of the new media, and it's a closed circuit. And once again, you're not going to get on Joe Rogan's show, but name some people off the top of your head in St. Louis who have a fairly well listened to podcast. I mean, one of them we had on the air by accident last week, James Strong. He used to be in the radio business, and now he's retired. He retired from his job, and he has two loves in his life. He podcasts, and he works on his classic 1952 Jaguar, which he's been working on for years and things like that. But he's very influential kind of guy, and he's very
yeah. Well, that makes sense, Brad. And then so you also heard from Bill Eigel. What did Bill Eigel have to say?
Bill Eigel was very interesting, and he'll get a kick out of this. I was the very last questioner, and I stood up and I said, "Bill Eigel, what office are you going to run for next?" And he chuckled. He said, "Well, I was on Brad's show the other day." And he gave this crazy, weird, convoluted answer like he did with me on the air. You can't pin him down. And he said, well, I'm thinking about maybe county council or county executive. But he did throw out some things that he says there's some federal offices that he's interested in, but he did say he's not going to run for a rep. Now, what's he going to run for? Is he going to run for senator next go around? Would that be when's the next? Well, that wouldn't be till 2028, wouldn't it be? The next Senate.
Correct. Yeah. So, but what you're saying is that he didn't indicate for certain that he's running for county exec.
No, he was did not really come out and say that. He says his options are open, and which is the same thing he said to me, which is the same thing he says to everybody, which, and it's the fascination with everybody's concerned about what Bill Eigel's going to do next. And he talked about, and I will give him credit, it was a very well, off the top of his head, presentation. He talked about the fact that when he decided to run for Senate, and once again, in the political hierarchy, normally if you're running for a state office, you run for state rep first. That's the first step, because a lot of the a lot of state senators are former state reps. Wouldn't you say that's pretty much the pecking order that it happens in most of the time?
That's true. You're exactly right.
So he talked about that, he had background of being in the service and then owning his own business, which he was one of my clients, to talk about that St. Louis Skylights. And he talked about the fact that he essentially said, and he came out and said this forcefully, if you do not feel comfortable door knocking, forget about running for office. That's what he said. And what was interesting was Bob Eno is the chairman of the St. Charles County Republican Central Committee, and Bill Eigel said that one of the doors he knocked when he first started door knocking for Senate 8 years ago, Bob Eno. And,
wow, nice.
Yeah, and once again, one of these like 6 degrees of separation kind of things. But he said what was interesting is most of the time the people will engage you. Most of the time it's not like, hey, get off my lawn. It's not like that. It's not that kind of stuff. But he said, do an intro. Hi, I'm Bill Eigel. I'm here to, I'm running for state Senate. I'm a Republican. I'm a conservative. And I just wanted to see if you have a minute or two for me to tell you about what my views are. He said most of the time they'll pick it up from there. Well, I don't like the fact that, and that whatever their pet peeve is or what they think should be a new law or a law taken away and stuff like that. It was interesting. It was well done. Debbie McFarland sent me, nice little text afterwards and said that they thought it had been very successful. The review by the people who were there was very positive. And once again, I think it's an interesting exercise in if you don't like the way things are, and rather than you stand on the sidelines and say, oh, I can't believe this is happening, or I can't believe this law is in, or it shouldn't be in, or it should be, thrown out, or this guy's a jerk and he's a crook. Stop complaining and start acting. Get into the game and essentially do what you can, which is true of so many different things outside of politics, right? If you don't,
it is. I mean, so what you're saying is make sure you get yard signs first.
But see,
the first step should be designing a yard sign. Like, there's nothing more important than a yard sign, I would say.
Well,
right?
Okay. I gave my crazy example of what I would do with the yard sign. And you know what I do with the yard sign? You know what I do with the yard sign?
Turn them upside down?
I turn all my yard signs upside down. And I looked back in the audience, and I think I got, and my eyesight is not that good, but Tom Smith was sitting there listening. I think I got an eye roll from Tom Smith because of the fact that, and once again, my big point to all of them was, to the average person, the election becomes a blur. The election becomes a blur when you're driving down the street, especially you go back to the primary back in August. There's yard signs everywhere, and it gets to the point where you don't even see them. They just blend in with the scenery. And to me, when you see something, and this is successful communications 101. When you break through that barrier, and especially with so many different messages being thrown at people nowadays, on the radio and TV and social media and billboards and now what's called OOH, out of home advertising. If you're able to break through one of those with one of those messages, you have succeeded. And to me, an upside down yard sign is breaking through the blur that becomes an election cycle. I mean, what do you think?
I think that when you approach the front of the room, the 10 or 12 people, however many were there, not counting speakers, I looked at the pictures. It looks like there were 10 or 12 people there. I think they should have played your entrance music of Yard Signs Suck.
No, there were more than that. I think they were actually, the final count, I think there were 22 people there who were running for office.
Wow.
Yeah.
Hey, and you know what? That's a really good turnout, especially considering that a lot of people who need the training, Brad, believe that they already know. And they're like, well, I don't need – that's for first-time candidates or that's for amateurs. Like, to get 20 to 22 people, if that's a legitimate count, that's a lot of people to come to a candidate school.
Right. And once again, I mean, did I make any money off of it? Did anybody buy any advertising from me the first time around? No. Is anybody going to buy any advertising from me? And the first election would be the April Muni, which would be what, school board? Is that mayors as well too? Is that
correct? Certain? Yeah, municipal elections.
And
yeah.
Is there an August primary next year? There's not.
No,
is there?
There's not. Nope.
So there's no August primary. There's no August general in 2025. Correct?
Correct.
So this would all be just munis kind of stuff, muni and school board and stuff like that. But some of the people there, they did ask, some of the people are already, well, I'm looking to run in 2026. I'm looking to run in 2028. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, these people, at least have a vision and they're trying to, not, oh, good, the election's in 3 months. Maybe I should run, that kind of a thing. You know what I mean?
You're just happy that you didn't get thrown out, Brad. It's nice for you to attend the St. Charles County Republican event where you're not chased by the highway patrol.
I won't tell that story again because it gets old for the people.
Shout out to Cindy Cristofanelli.
Yeah, well, she's
terrific.
She wasn't there. No, and I tried to think of any of the other politicians. I think that was pretty much it. Okay, we ran long on that. We have to take a break. We'll be back.
Thanks for checking out the Brad and John Show podcast. This segment of the show is brought to you by John Combest's book, Stalking, Harassment, Internet Trolling, A Guide to Recovering and Rebuilding After Online Attacks. It's a great reference if you've ever been the unfortunate target of a social media attack. It's available on Amazon. Just search John Combest. That's Combest, John Combest, and the book will show up in your search results. Now it's time for another segment of the Brad and John Show. Can you handle it?